This particular video is going to show you how to make your header file for a C++ program when we are separating out the implementation. You're going to have a header file, your implementation, which is a .cpp file, and a driver file, which is .cpp. I've already done this process, but I'm going to actually step through it again just to show you how it works. The first thing that you want to do is over here under header files, you want to right click and you're going to add a new item. That new item should be named the same as your class. So you can just delete this and type in the name of your class. It will automatically put in that .h at the end. I have already done this, so I'm going to click cancel. You would click add. When I created there's a couple different ways that you guys can do this. Number one, you could copy over your class diagram. I would strongly encourage you to start putting a class diagram into your documentation in your code. And the class diagram actually is basically your header file. You have to switch up a few things, but that's one way to copy it over. Another way, which maybe will prevent some typo errors, is you could literally copy this whole entire class. And I'm going to show you this method. And then you delete out all the extra stuff. And I'll explain that in a second. Don't forget that we now also need to include a deconstructor. I don't remember if we've talked about that, but a deconstructor is what cleans up the memory at the end of your program, and this is what it looks like. It's a tilde, name of the class, parens, curly brace, semicolon. To make my header file, I'm going to copy this over to my person.h class, and I'm going to pretend that I haven't already done this, and if that's the case, this is what my screen would look like. C++ puts in this line of code up here that's called pragma once. Pragma once basically makes sure that you don't copy over extra files into your project, okay? I'll explain that a little bit more in a few minutes, but we want to have that line of code. I'm using the string class, so I should make sure that I pound include string. But the other thing that's going to happen when I do this is a very common error, is that even though I pound include string, it doesn't recognize it. It doesn't recognize it because string is in the namespace standard. And so if I say using namespace standard, then that clears up that error message. However, that's not the correct thing to do when you set up your header file. You should never use a namespace in your header files. The Stack Overflow says basically what that does is it copies over the whole entire namespace, which is kind of like a super class, sort of. And so what happens is in the future, if any changes get made to that and it isn't happy or it might be in conflict with your program, so you should never do that. What we need to do instead is every place that string is used, I need to specifically say that I'm going to use the standard template by putting the std : in front of that. That : is what we call a scope resolution operator, and you'll probably hear me say that a few times. But it's telling you what scope or what class you're pulling that data from. So when you set up your header file, you're going to include your instance fields like we have here, and then you only include your prototypes for your functions. So I'm going to delete out all of these double curly braces. I'm deleting out every single body, so to speak, for all of my functions that I have written. Every single one of them. They all get deleted. So this is one way that you can create your header file. The header file only controls or contains the prototypes, because this is when you go to release a project, basically you only want to include the prototypes. You want to include the template, the signature, so to speak, that you are sharing with the user. You don't want to include the actual code. Now, the other thing that we do with a header file is I only include the data types. I never include the actual names of the variables. So it's going to be a string here, and we're going to delete all the variable names out. And then last but not least, we have to put a semicolon at the end of each of these. And then I have pound include string. I don't think it's recognizing that I really do need to have a std here because I had done a namespace before. So this is what our header file should look like. If I bring my code back up that I had done before, just to double check to make sure that I have everything, I'm going to double check that it's the same and that we've got everything included. And again, make sure every time you use string, you've got std in front of it here, and we should be good to go. Now, the last thing that I'm going to mention is that, and I'm going to delete this out because we are now done with that. That was just my double check. The last thing I'm going to mention is this. Your textbook will, instead of using pragma once, it will use these 3 lines of code. It will use pound if and def, and then it will include pound indif, like this, okay? So here's the deal. If you don't use pragma once, you need to use these 3 lines of code. Pound, if not defined, is what that stands for. The name of the class, _H for header file, and that all has to be capitalized. Basically what that says is if this header file is not defined, please go ahead and define it in the project. Otherwise, ignore it because we've already got it defined. So it helps reduce duplication of code is what it does. And you don't want it, because every time you have like a pound include in your file, it copies over all of those things in that library or all of the things in those files. So you can use pragma once, or you can use those 3 lines of code that I pasted in there. I'm going to stick with the pragma once because that's the newest version of what they want us to do, and the word on the street, if I look at Stack Overflow and such, is that using the pragma once is better if your compiler and your system is accepting it. So this is what our header file should look like, and that's how to set up your header file. Next, we will talk about setting up the implementation of the person.cpp class.